Shalom and welcome again to another edition of Seekers of Meanin, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Adress, and I greatly appreciate you being with us. With these podcasts, we hope to explore issues that touch us and our families in light of the revolution in longevity that is reshaping our Jewish world. We appreciate your support. You can follow us and listen to previous podcasts by going to our website, jewishsacredaging.com, as well as our Jewish Sacred Aging Facebook page. And we're grateful for your donations, which help further our work. And today we welcome to our podcast microphones Dr. Jeff Levin, University Professor of Epidemiology and Population Health at Baylor University, the Baylor Bears in beautiful Waco, Texas. Hi, Jeff. It's nice to see you, nice to greet you, and I appreciate your being with us. We want to talk about your brand new book, a really great book, and I thank you for it, called Religion and Medicine, A History of the Encounter Between Humanity's Two Greatest Institutions. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's wonderful to be here.
Oh, Rabbi, you can drive. We've known each other for a while, so you can.
Okay, Richie, good to see you.
It can be very formal if you want, anyway. This is a great book, and from any colleagues or education people listening or to this podcast, I suggest you take a look at it because it really could form a very interesting text for an adult education series that explores the whole analysis of Judaism and medicine and the background of that, because there's a lot to talk about. Jeff, you've written a lot, you've spoken a lot. I've heard you speak and teach at other conferences in the last several years. On issues of health, religion, medicine. Is this book the culmination of just years and years and years of study?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just say, by the way, I need to hire you as a publicist. Thank you so much for that intro. But yes, absolutely. This book is kind of the capstone of 35, 40 years of my own work since the mid-1980s. I'm an epidemiologist, and I've been doing basic research, empirical research on the effects on physical and mental health and aging of people's faith, their spirituality. But over the years, it struck me that the conversation, if you will, between the institutions of medicine, institutions of faith, is much broader than how I was engaging it. There's bioethics and history and pastoral care, policy, and so on. And so I wanted to kind of zoom the lens out a little bit and step back and look at the history of the interconnections or the encounter between medicine and religion in the broadest sense. So yes, this book is kind of a summary statement and a capstone. And I don't know if it's my last word on the subject, but yes, it's kind of a culmination of my career.
You say that these are the two greatest institutions of humanity. Talk to me about that.
Well, I would assert that they are, in the broadest sense of the word, religion, faith, spirituality, and medicine, healthcare are maybe the two most influential, the two most impactful, and they're reciprocally impactful. I think if you go back and look at the history of faith, the history of religion, you can't tell that story without talking about healing and without medicine. And if you talk about the history of medicine and healthcare and healers, you can't do that without talking about the history of religion. As we're finding, unfortunately, the last few months, that as some historians have asserted for many, many years, many decades, the rise and fall of disease outbreaks and pandemic illness is one of the most, if not the most influential force in the rise and fall of nations. It's one of the most significant forces in all of history. And certainly as people, you and I and others who work in the religious field, we understand that those things that provide meaning to people, that provide a sense of understanding, making sense of the world, which religion is one, is probably the most personally impactful aspect of human life, the things that shape how we believe and how we act. So together, I would assert, yes, that medicine and religion in the broadest sense are probably the most substantial, impactful human institutions that have been created. Not necessarily all for good. I mean, that's another conversation, for good and for bad. But there are few things I can think of that have had a greater influence and impact on human civilization.
Certainly in Judaism, the marriage and the linkage between faith, Judaism, and the practice of medicine is well documented, and they really grow together. They really grow together. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if you look at Jewish history, and this, some of our, and I think I mentioned this in the introduction of the book, some of the greatest rabbinic figures, especially in the medieval time, in the time when the rabbinic codes were being codified, the post-Talmudic time, some of these greatest figures were also doctors. The Rambam, right. Maimonides was a doctor. Sephorno was a doctor. Nachmanides was a doctor. And in the present day, so many of the great figures in bioethics are Orthodox rabbis or Reform rabbis, and also physicians, also doctors. And I think that when you look at the Gentile world, the difficult, the uneasy discourse among science and religion, or among medicine and religion, I don't know that same type of discordance exists within Judaism. I don't know that the same sort of conflict between science and religion exists at the same scale, that we're either in one camp or the other. I think that rabbinical figures have contributed to science and religion in our tradition, and great medical figures and healers have been important figures in the rabbinate. So I would say for us, the two institutions kind of go hand in hand. Now, that doesn't mean everything's wonderful and peachy and we're all singing Kumbaya, but I don't see the same sort of conflict that I do in other traditions.
As a scientist and an epidemiologist, how concerned are you right now? Because this is being recorded and we're still in the middle of the pandemic, and there's constant debate about alleged conflict between science and politics and this. And how much of this really bothers you? Do you think, because of this pandemic, go ahead, the conflict is being exacerbated?
It's funny, the last few weeks, as you can imagine, I've been doing lots of media. I had a big piece on CNN. I've been doing lots of stuff. I've been putting on my epidemiologist hat for once. People at Baylor know me as a religious scholar, but really I'm a scientist. And so I've been commenting on this a lot, mainly on the issue of the influence of religion and congregations and pastors on the course of this outbreak, this epidemic. And I've seen positive and I've seen negative. On the one hand, there are in our community, and I'm sure in New Jersey, I'm sure in New York, I'm sure everywhere in the country, there are congregations, there are clergy of all faiths who are stepping up. They're acting with compassion. They are acting with an eye toward justice. They are acting in a way to contribute to a solution, to be of service to sentient beings, as a Dalai Lama would say, being of service to all our brothers and sisters, and in my mind, fulfilling our halakhic mandates to act with compassion, to act for justice, to do as the Mishnah says. Upon these three things, the world stands on justice, compassion, gemilut chasadim, all of that. On the other hand, because there's always another hand, we have seen, especially, I'm sad to say, in the South, it sounds like a cliche, but there have been churches, there have been pastors that have been not just skirting public health guidelines, but really disobediently rebelling against them. More so probably a month ago or a month or two ago, holding Easter services with hundreds of people when the outbreak was really at its peak, putting people at risk, claiming that it was a hoax, that it was a Zionist conspiracy, God forbid, and so on, and a bunch of nonsense. And people were dying. There was the instance, I think maybe you saw it in the news, and I don't remember if this was Louisiana or Florida. I get these mixed up because there's so many of these stories coming out, but there was a pastor that would absolutely refused to practice social distancing, to do any of this stuff, and he had a lawyer who was representing him in court, and during Easter service, the lawyer got COVID-19 and he died eventually. So I think for every positive, for every sense that this is bringing people together, on the other hand, there are, religion is being a source of, it's being a negative source. It's being a source of hate. It's being a source of, I don't even know how to say it, to separate this, to pull us apart. And It's unfortunate because just like the protests that are going on, there are people that are acting compassionately. There are people that are working in an interfaith way to bring people together to work for justice. And there are other people that are out there, waving their hands and saying, we're going to bring in the military. And so I think that actually both of these crises are an example of how institutions of faith and religious leaders can work for good. They can work for bad. And it's I've got an article just out, I think, in the next couple of days in one of the medical journals about religion and the COVID-19 situation. And if I recall, don't quote me, my subtitle is something like "Part of the Problem or Part of the Solution." And to me, it's an open question. I don't think we know what when the postmortems are done, so to speak, we'll be able to answer this better. But religion is not all good. It's not all bad. It's just kind of a domain of life. And it can be filled with goodness. It can be filled with good people and positivity and people working for healing in all senses of the word healing, physically and socially and politically. And it can be a receptacle for sludge, for vile people doing awful, terrible things. And so it's up to each one of us. It's up to each one of us how we're going to represent our faith. And will it be a force for healing or will it be a force for disunity?
Well, you actually, the reason why I wanted to ask you, because you also mentioned this in a way in the book. In the beginning of the book, you have this line which says, the encounter between religion and medicine for much of the past millennium and recently still is marked by contention and controversy. So, I mean, maybe you were prescient enough when you wrote that to understand that this, because it really is exactly what you're talking about, this ongoing contention.
Absolutely. And, to be perfectly honest, just for potential readers, the book is mostly on the positive side of this. And the reason is that so much of the discourse in the past, 30 years or so on religion and health, religion and medicine, has highlighted kind of the negativity of this. And we see news stories all the time of fundamentalist pastors threatening to blow up family planning clinics. And it's horrible stuff. We've all seen these stories about people denying medical treatment for their sick children, and just one story after another. And so that narrative has been told. It's out there. I just want to try to present the other side of the story, but absolutely, the other side of the story does not negate the negative aspect. I mean, I think, as here in Texas. One of two of the leading forces in the movement against vaccines, which in this day and age is disastrous, with the potential now that there will be a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine coming up. We don't need anti-vax people running around being crazy. But two of the greatest impetus for that was the ministry of Kenneth Copeland, who's a TV evangelist up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and then kind of the New Age community centered in Austin. And so, this is an example of religion in the broadest sense of the word being a force for not healing, the opposite of healing. So again, these stories have been told. We've all seen them. We've all heard them. But, there's another side to this. And it just really hasn't been examined and hasn't been propounded in a public sense.
You begin the book with this. Reference to called "I Have an Earache," which is really cool. And you posted. It goes, "I have an earache. 2000 BCE. Here, eat this root. 1000 CE. Here, say this prayer. 1850 of the Common Era. Drink this potion. 1930, swallow this pill. 1950, take this antibiotic. And 2000, here, eat this root and say this prayer." First of all, this is, you say, is all over the internet, but unpack that we've gone from to eat the root and say the prayer.
What's old is new again, right? It's just something that came from a slide that I've been using back when people had slides, for 25 years or 30 years. It's just all over the internet. I don't know what the source is. I've seen it on 100 websites. But basically, to unpack it, it's kind of the history of medicine. It started out in the days of antiquity, medicine was all about, shamans and prayers and rituals and herbs, and then scientific medicine came to the fore. And now, since, in the era of, it used to be called alternative medicine, and then it was complementary medicine, now it's integrative medicine. Before that, it was holistic healing. Now, all of a sudden, we're back to prayers and roots and herbs. And let me just say this: I'm very sympathetic to the critique. Myself and I were both epidemiologists. We're totally cool with all types of medical alternatives. In fact, I chaired NIH's first panel on quantitative research in alternative medicine years ago. I'm very positive for alternative medicine. But I think for a lot of folks in the mainstream of academic Western biomedicine, this development, from antibiotics and surgery and high tech to all of a sudden we're back to herbs and prayer and mind, body, whatever. It's not necessarily a positive development. It's maybe a little unsavory development. So I think the burden is on those of us who are researchers, who are scholars and scientists, to do the research to demonstrate whether or not there's any efficacy to this stuff. And this in the spectrum of all everything that's in the book, there's one chapter specifically about research on religion and health. And that really has been my role in this field since, I guess, the early 80s. And I mean, to cut to the chase, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of published empirical studies in the medical literature showing that the aspects of prayer or faith or spirituality are statistically significantly impactful on less depression, less anxiety, greater longevity, and so on. So yes, this stuff does seem to work. And yes, even herbs, this stuff does work. And this is where we are now in medicine. And what I see as somebody who, while I am in a religious studies institute at Baylor, I'm a medical scientist, and I keep up with that field. And my wife is a medical school professor, and I can say that it's kind of an easy development. Medicine seems to be vectoring off in two directions. There's the humanistic, the mind, body, spirit angle, and then there's this increasingly high-tech, depersonalized angle. And I don't see a lot of integration. I see them kind of, again, vectoring off in different directions. And I don't know what that's going to mean for us in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. I wish there were more integration. We certainly need technology. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we do it at the expense of humanistic values or of the inner spirit, I think we're doing a lot of damage. And it's a strange time for medicine. There was this openness to spirit and openness to human values, and now the high tech stuff is kind of running off in another direction. So it's an unusual time to be a medical scientist, to be a doctor, and to be potentially a patient. It's a strange time. That's probably my most lucid way to address that. And I'm not. I don't know what the future portends.
So let me. You alluded to this chapter. It's a great chapter. One of my favorite chapters in the book, where you really you take a look at a lot of the research. You mentioned Dr. Koenig's institute at Duke, and you highlight some of the other institutes. Some friends of mine at UT Medical, Sam Karp's Institute, Tom Cole, who's done a podcast for me before on some of this stuff. His institute, I think your forward is by Stephen Post, who's been very, very active in a lot of this stuff. So you really channel a lot of this, and you talk about some of the research. So a lot of this stuff I remember from the Larry Dossey days and some of the other journals and magazines that I don't think exist anymore. The power of prayer and the efficacy of prayer. I know there have been studies. I mention this to synagogues all the time in membership. They're worried about all kinds of membership. And I say, there's enough studies out that say if you're a member of a religious organization or a faith community, you're going to live longer. Why don't you just put a big billboard up on the interstate and say, join Temple Whoopee, and if you do, you're going to live longer? Because so talk to me about this those studies about the efficacy of prayer and the power of prayer. And just this series of institutes around the United States that are studying this.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I think the important thing to convey here, and this sometimes gets confused, and there are, nobody knows how many studies of religion have. Maybe there have been 10,000 by now, and most of them find something. Not all of them, but most of them do. Only a very small subset of those are what we would call RCTs, randomized controlled trials of prayer, oftentimes prayer to distance. Most of the research is just standard social behavioral epidemiologic research on looking at populations of people that are religious or not religious, or do this practice or that practice, and then looking at their subsequent rates of illness or disease or death or mental health or whatever. These studies, for the most part, are not particularly controversial. They're just garden variety social or behavioral epidemiologic research. But a subset of studies beginning in the late 80s actually were randomized controlled trials of people conducting absent prayer to distance. And this was most consternating in the medical world. The first study, wasn't the first study done, but the first one to come to note was in the Southern Medical Journal in 1988 by a guy named Dr. Randy Bird. And this was essentially, it was almost like a drug trial. It's a control group, an experimental group, and it was completely double-blinded. And at any rate, the people they were prayed for, they had less complications after the heart procedures and less intubation, and their hospital stay was shorter. And this was just, this is a study that caught the eye of Larry Dawsey, and he began his work. And he discovered that there actually were maybe 200 of these studies out there. Well, since this was all 30 plus years ago, since that time, there have been a lot more research. By all accounts, it seems that prayer at a distance, not what we call local prayer. Certainly, if somebody is with you and they're laying on hands or praying for you, it's understandable why there might be some sort of benefit, perhaps for psychosomatic reasons. But we're talking about prayer where the people don't know they're being prayed for, and the people praying don't know who they're praying. Really, truly double-blinded studies. And we have found, and I say we, I haven't done this research, I've written about it, that throughout these studies, there seems to be, on the whole, a positive effect. And so what is the source of that effect? I mean, that's really the big question. Is it God? Is it Jesus? Is it some sort of subtle bioenergy radiating from our heart shots? Is it consciousness? I mean, that's the open. And I think because science is not able to right answer that question, that has led to the disrepute of so many. But the thing I try to do in my book is summarize this work and say that, you know, you can like it or you cannot like it, but these studies have been done and they're out there and they're real. And yeah, some of them aren't very good. Some of them are a little fly by night, but a whole lot of them are real good, and they dot their I's and they cross their T's, and they've been published in very good top line peer reviewed medical journals, and seems to be something there. To me, there's a subtext to this whole story that I find very interesting. That you know, Richie, people have been praying to God or praying to whomever for thousands of years, billions of times, for billions of diseases, and some folks have gotten better for whatever reasons, serendipitous, supernatural, who knows? But only now, right now in the 21st century, using medical research, medical technology, by gosh, are we going to solve this and figure it out and be able to determine whether, this is real or valid? I find that attitude in some way, I find it kind of humorous and almost a little perturbing. And there's a lot of hubris in it, that only now through medical research, we're going to solve this problem of this prayer work. And, I think that these studies, to a point, can show that there's something there, that there's some efficacy. But I don't think the average person is going to stop praying if some randomized trial at Harvard shows a non-significant effect of something on something. So I'm positive toward this work. I think it's fascinating. And yes, it does show something. But I'm skeptical that medical researchers are going to be the people that are going to adjudicate the issue of whether God answers prayer. I'm more than skeptical of that.
Let me ask you a question, because this has come up a lot in the pandemic and working with congregations around the country. the biggest concern amongst lay people and my colleagues is the virtual nature now of a lot of prayer and services as opposed to the community. It seemed to me that this flows right out of what you were talking about, that the power of actually being in community, in touch with, seeing other people in proximity to each other, as opposed to seeing them on a little 1-inch square on a box on a screen, that does make a difference. Have you any thoughts about the power of being in community? I mean, Judaism has the minyan. Judaism is a community. Can you just riff on that a bit?
Sure. I think that by not being together, at our show we meet on Zoom, and it's lovely. It's better than not meeting. I mean, thank God, at least we're a conservative show, so we're maybe a little more flexible in halakha. I mean, so I think it counts as a minyan. But yes, something is lost when you aren't together. When you get, it's a wonderful thing. Hini matov, right? When we all get together and join together as a people, and there actually is about 50 to 60 years of epidemiologic research that shows that being in community with other people is good for your health and good for your, and even good for your longevity. And that not being in community with people, there was a study done in Science, published in the journal Science decades ago, that not being in community with people, not having positive connected social relationships, was as much as or even more of a risk factor for premature death than smoking, if you can believe that. I mean, but the study was done. And so, yes, I think by not being with other folks, something is lost. On the other hand, were we to be with other folks in ways that aren't sensible, we would be putting ourselves at risk. And so there's nobody to blame here. We shouldn't be necessarily gathering together like we did before. We have to wait a little bit longer. But let me argue on the other side. To be in virtual community, I think it's terrific. I think there's lots of positives. We've had more attendance at our Friday night and our Saturday morning minyanim, judging by how many people sign on to Zoom, than we've had at Shul. And so it's terrific. People who maybe haven't been in a long time now are showing up. It's great. And there's more of a sense of community. And in some ways, I think there's more and better learning going on than there was in show before. So that's great. The other thing, I've connected, we lived in Kansas for years. I've connected with our temple, our Reform temple in Topeka. So I daven with our show from 6 to 7 on Friday nights. And then at 7:30, I check in with our temple. And it's awesome. And I've checked in with some other temples. And I visited here in Waco on Facebook. I've checked in. I've admit to some of the local Baptist churches on Easter. I think there's something very, very positive. And certainly from the standpoint of what we were talking about a moment ago, I mean, prayer is non-local anyway, as Larry Dawsey would say. God can answer prayer whether we're on Zoom or in person or just alone in our house. So I don't think anything is lost there. But like so much around this topic, there's positives and there's negatives. So I don't know what side to come down on. But yes, we've lost something, but maybe we've gained something too.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Maybe it'll carry over when the pandemic's done.
Well, we don't. That's the question. A lot of my colleagues they're reporting have greater attendance, because of this, their adult education, their Torah study. The question is, 6 months from now or whatever, and things go, we de-Zoom. Will everybody get in their car by Friday night and say, I really got used to sitting in my, my pajamas, having a glass of wine, doing Oseh Shalom. So it's going to be very, very, very interesting as to what's going to happen.
In my opinion, truthfully, I think people will come back, and it'll be, different. In Texas, it's going to be a lot sooner than 6 months. It might be in another month or two, but I think people will come back. I think, again, and I've got to say this as a medical person, if you're elderly, if you're obese, if you have a pre-existing, chronic respiratory disease, still, social distance. But for the rest of people, I think they'll come back. I think there will be a phased in kind of thing. Not everyone will come back all at once, but when they do and they find out everything's okay, they'll come back. And maybe this whole experience with Zoom and everything else, it will serve to borrow some terminology from my Baptist Baylor friends here, it will have served an evangelistic function to draw people into faith that maybe wouldn't have been involved in it before. So we'll see.
Because there are people who are experiencing this because of electronics that never would have before. Let me before we start running out of time, I just want to ask you another issue about medical education and spirituality, because you alluded to it. There was a conference in February of this year, of 2020, at Arizona State University that talked about medical education and spirituality, and I recorded my speech there because I had another good friend's funeral that I had to officiate at. But the theme of the conference, Jeff, was there's growing rise, according to them, of medical schools incorporating teachings about spirituality, both for the patient and the medical student, based upon some of the Rachel Remen stuff and others, the Jewish people, George Washington. Are you seeing this more and more? And B, what do you think the benefit of this is?
Well, absolutely. And there's a backstory to this. Back in the early 90s, at the time, there were like 125 medical schools. Now there are like 150. There were maybe like 3 that did anything. And it was just like a random lecture in the first 2 years. But then over time, these numbers increased. And probably the person most responsible for this was our friend, the late David Larson. He got a grant from Templeton Foundation, and he developed people will develop courses. As of the time I finished the book manuscript, which is like a year ago, I think the number, I think at least maybe 80 to 90% of North American medical schools had something on this. Some places like Duke or Emory had an entire, Center for Research and Education. You mentioned GW, Christina Pekelski's shop. Other places maybe just have a lecture. Other places have shadowing or coattailing experiences where you work with pastoral care people. But the point is, this is not a new development. There's about a 30-year backstory on this, and it's been a slow build. And at this point, it's actually the norm that medical schools, and more so even nursing schools, have some sort of instruction. And by that, just ways to enable medical students or nursing students or health sciences students to understand that the spiritual dimension of life is one of the dimensions of life. You yourself, you can believe in God, you can be religious, you cannot be religious, you cannot believe in God, who cares? But your patients, your clients, for them, many of them, this is an important aspect of your life, and you simply should be familiar with the nuts and bolts. You should understand the things that drive people's behavior for good, for positive, for negative, and just have an understanding of it. And I don't think there's any downside. And again, you as a doctor may or may not believe in any of this, but your patients may, and you should be sensitive to it. Especially, you should know when and how to make referrals to healthcare chaplains. You should know how to help people maintain, if they're hospitalized, continuity with the religious life in their community and so on. And there's just some basic, simple nuts and bolts. And so in that sense, I think this is a very positive development. But again, there's a backstory. This isn't a new thing. It's been going on since I started my academic career. But it's just in recent years, it's expanded. And for a generation of medical students now, who it always amazes me, weren't alive, when I was first teaching medical school, the idea that spirituality is something that maybe you have a lecture series on in medical school, there's nothing. It's like, yeah, of course, it's just one of the subjects we learn about. So to me, that's really nice that this just becomes a tacit part of medical education.
As we start to run out of time here, one last thing I want to ask your opinion on, and it's one of my favorite quotes. It's from the Heschel essay speech that he gave for the AMA, I think in 1964, and from an essay that he published called "The Patient is a Person." It's a beautiful essay. And he writes the following: the doctor is God's partner in the struggle between life and death. Religion is medicine in the form of prayer. Medicine is religion in the form of a deed. Could you just, I love that quote. Really, I think speaks to really your book.
Well, that's a beautiful quote. And I think that is certainly for Jews. I can't speak for anyone else, but for Jews, doctors and health professionals of all type are engaged in a sacred calling. There's something sacred about what they do. And again, this goes back to what I was saying before. We don't necessarily see this conflict between religion and science and medicine. It's a calling. It's a meaningful calling. It's a sacred calling. And people that work for healing in the broad sense of the term or in the narrow sense of the term are doing Hashem's work. And and to me, that's a very Jewish perspective, that God created us and we're here, but we aren't passive. We're co-creators. We're actors along with God. And I don't know, the quote, I hadn't heard that quote, but it's beautiful. It just kind of reinforces that to me, that our job, and of course, in Judaism, there's the famous mandate to heal. We don't necessarily believe in a positive right to healthcare. Of course we do, but not in the same sense that Gentile bioethics would put it forward. But we believe that there is a duty, there is a mandate for all of us, including doctors, to be agents of healing. And that's a little bit different perspective, but I think it speaks to how much we value healing and how much we consider healing to be a religious value and something that should be encouraged and participated in by people of faith.
Yeah, I'm always struck by, there's a passage in the morning Amidah, the weekday prayer service, that says, heal us, O Lord, and we shall be healed. And when you teach this, I always ask a congregation or a group of people, says, what are we praying for? They all say, well, it says you're praying for healing. I said, but we're not praying for. We're not praying for a cure. It's as if Judaism from the beginning understood that it can be healed spiritually without being cured of a disease. And it's a tremendous insight, I think, of the tradition and this marriage, this blending of spirituality, Judaism, and medicine. So Dr. Jeff Levin, University Professor of Epidemiology and Population Health at Baylor. The new book, which I really urge everybody to go out there and buy it, because it may not be a movie yet to sell the movie.
Right.
But the book is called Religion and Medicine, A History of the Encounter Between Humanity's Two Greatest Institutions. Get it for a great resource for an adult education, a mini class on religion, Judaism, and medicine. And as Jeff has outlined in the book, tremendous amount of Jewish involvement from our scholars. So, Jeff, thank you very, very much for being with us. Good luck with the book. Stay healthy. Stay safe down there in Waco.
Thank you, Richie. I appreciate it so much.
You'll be good. Just take care of yourself. I hope to bump into you sometime soon in the next couple of years. Continued good luck. And for all of you, thank you again for listening to this edition of Seekers of Meanin, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. A reminder, you can follow us on our website, jewishsacredaging.com, and our Facebook page, Jewish Sacred Aging, as well as the special Jewish Sacred Aging on podcast page on Facebook. And if you wish to make a tax-free donation to help further our work, please go to the website and click on the donate icon, and feel free to send me suggestions, comments, or requests to rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. These podcasts are produced at the studios of Lubetkin Global Media in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and we thank our producer, Steve Lubetkin. Thank you again for being with us. We look forward to greeting you on the next Seekers of Meanin, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. Todah and Shalom.